Every era has a moment where the noise fades and reality finally speaks louder than ideology. This video is about one of those moments. It is about what happens when economic gravity reasserts itself after decades of pretending it no longer applies. Stay with me until the end because what we are going to talk about today explains not just where we are, but why so many people feel blindsided by how fast everything is changing. Like, before we get into it, make sure you like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear this, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell and select all if you want more Angry Guy content and want every single video the moment we release it. It helps the channel more than most people realize. Also, if you want to protect and safeguard your assets and grow your wealth, go check out Angry's Crypto Academy. It is linked in the description of the video. The Academy teaches you how to buy, sell, and trade crypto responsibly, how to think long term, and how to avoid the mistakes that wipe people out during unstable economic periods. If you are serious about financial self defense, go check it out now. And if you are enjoying these Angry Guy videos and want to show support, you can buy me a Red Bull using the link in the description. It keeps the lights on and the content coming. Now let us begin. What we are witnessing right now is not a sudden collapse that came out of nowhere. It is the delayed consequence of choices made over decades, choices that were celebrated at the time, rewarded socially, and insulated from criticism. For years, we were told that traditional economic roles were obsolete, that interdependence between men and women was no longer necessary, that individual empowerment alone could replace systems that had existed for thousands of years. Many people believe this because during good times, almost any idea can appear to work. Cheap money, stable supply chains, and expanding credit hide structural weaknesses. When times are easy, theory feels like reality. When times get hard, reality collects its debt. Across the world, rising rents, higher food costs, and persistent inflation are squeezing households in ways that cannot be ignored anymore. Surveys, reports, and personal stories are all pointing to the same uncomfortable truth. A growing number of women are saying they are struggling to afford basic living expenses on their own. Housing costs are consuming larger portions of income. Food prices have outpaced wage growth. Credit cards are filling the gap where savings no longer exist. This is not a moral judgment, it is an economic observation. Numbers do not care about slogans. For a long time, modern consumer economies relied on a simple but powerful structure. Men, on average, generated the majority of surplus production through physically demanding, technically specialized, or high risk labor. Women, on average, drove the majority of consumer spending and household allocation decisions. This balance worked because it was reciprocal. Income flowed in, expenses flowed out, and families functioned as economic units that absorbed shocks better than individuals could. When that system was dismantled socially without being replaced economically, the bill did not arrive immediately, it waited. One of the least discussed realities is how much modern consumption depends on male generated surplus. Even in systems where women control a large share of spending decisions, the underlying productive base often still skews male. This does not diminish women, it simply reflects occupational distribution, risk tolerance, and labor specialization patterns that persist across cultures. When marriage rates decline, long term partnerships decrease, and shared financial responsibility disappears. The consumer side of the equation begins to wobble. Spending does not vanish overnight, but it increasingly shifts to debt. Debt is the quiet predator in this story. It does not announce itself loudly. It arrives as convenience, flexibility, independence. Over time, it becomes obligation, anxiety, and limitation. Many women who once relied on dual income households or long term partners now find themselves shouldering rising costs alone. When income cannot keep up, credit steps in. When credit maxes out, options narrow. Some are downsizing, Some are relocating, some are taking on multiple jobs, others are living in cars, rotating gym memberships for showers, and hoping the next month will be easier than the last. This is not empowerment, this is survival. At the same time, the labor market itself is shifting in ways that disproportionately affect certain sectors. Automation, artificial intelligence, and efficiency driven restructuring are not evenly distributed. Roles built around administration, coordination, compliance, and soft management layers are being reduced first. Many of these roles expanded rapidly over the last decade under corporate diversity initiatives and cultural signaling incentives. When companies are flush with capital, they can afford inefficiency. When margins tighten, they cannot. The result is predictable. The most recent roles created are often the first roles eliminated. This is where another uncomfortable reality emerges. Hiring based on optics rather than output creates fragility. When economic pressure rises, performance becomes the only metric that matters. Employees who were placed into positions without strong measurable contribution are more vulnerable, regardless of intent. This is not about gender. It is about incentives. Systems that reward appearance over competence eventually punish everyone involved. The people hired into these roles are harmed when the market corrects because their experience does not translate cleanly into roles that still exist. Meanwhile, many men have already adjusted to a very different economic reality. For years, men were told that traditional success markers were outdated, that participation in conventional career and family structures was optional, even undesirable. Some listened. They did not protest loudly. They did not demand to be heard. They simply disengaged. Millions of men have stepped away from conventional workforce participation, not necessarily by becoming idle, but by redefining what work looks like. Online businesses, contract work, gig income, trading, digital services, and minimalist lifestyles have replaced the old 9 to 5 model. Without the financial responsibility of supporting spouses and children, these men discovered something that is rarely acknowledged. It is far easier to survive and even be content on far less money when obligations are minimal. A small apartment, limited consumption, no social pressure to perform provider theatrics. The cost of living drops dramatically when the cost of expectations disappears. This is not glamorous. It is quiet, it is efficient, and it works. This shift has massive downstream effects that most institutions were not prepared for. Consumer spending weakens, housing demand changes, tax bases fluctuate, social programs strain. And perhaps most destabilizing of all, the traditional bargaining dynamics between men and women are altered. When men no longer need relationships to survive economically, and women increasingly struggle to maintain independence in a high cost environment, the leverage flips. Not because men demanded it, but because they removed themselves from the game. For decades, many men were told, directly or indirectly, that their presence was optional, their contributions undervalued, and their traditional roles unnecessary. They were encouraged to step aside, to make space, to accept diminished expectations. When they did exactly that, the system applauded. Now, as economic pressure mounts, there is growing confusion about why those men are not rushing back. The answer is simple and uncomfortable. People who find peace and independence do not easily return to systems that once rejected them. There is also a psychological component that rarely gets discussed honestly. Prolonged messaging that frames an entire group as problematic creates long lasting disengagement. When masculinity is consistently portrayed as something to be corrected rather than understood, many men internalize the message that withdrawal is safer than participation. Over time, disengagement becomes habit. Habit becomes identity. By the time economic conditions shift and cooperation is once again needed, the emotional infrastructure to rebuild trust no longer exists. What we are seeing now is not a sudden plea for partnership, It is a delayed recognition of interdependence. Societies function best when roles complement rather than compete. When one side is encouraged to walk away and the other is encouraged to stand alone, the result is not liberation. Hey guys, in a world pushing you to own nothing and be happy, crypto is your key to survival. Join Angry's Crypto Academy to master buying, selling, and trading crypto. Make huge profits and safeguard your wealth. Plus, discover the one crypto virtually no one is talking about, poised to create new millionaires in the upcoming bull run. The link is in the description of the video below. Go check it out now. It is fragmentation. Fragmented individuals are easier to manage during prosperity, but far more vulnerable during hardship. And this does not mean relationships should be transactional or coercive. It means pretending economics does not influence human behavior is a luxury belief. When survival becomes harder, priorities shift. Stability matters more. Cooperation matters more. But cooperation cannot be demanded retroactively. It must be cultivated over time. You cannot spend decades telling a group they are unnecessary and then expect them to return on command when conditions worsen. And there's a deeper lesson here that extends beyond gender dynamics. Systems that ignore human nature eventually collide with it. Incentives matter, responsibility matters, mutual benefit matters. When ideology tries to overwrite reality, reality waits patiently. It always does. Then it collects. We are entering a period where many long-standing assumptions will be tested under pressure. Independence will be reevaluated, minimalism will spread, parallel economies will grow, traditional institutions will struggle to adapt to populations that no longer need them in the same way. Some people will thrive in this transition, others will struggle deeply. The difference will not be belief, it will be preparation. This is why financial literacy, adaptability, and realistic planning matter now more than ever. Depending on systems that are already strained is risky. Depending on narratives instead of numbers is dangerous. The people who will make it through this period with the least damage are the ones who accepted uncomfortable truths early and adjusted accordingly. We are not witnessing the end of cooperation. We are witnessing the consequences of pretending cooperation was optional. The road ahead will force difficult conversations, both individually and collectively. Some will listen, some will resist, but economics does not negotiate. It only responds to behavior. To understand why this moment feels so destabilizing to so many people, you have to zoom out and look at how quickly the social contract was rewritten without any real economic testing. For most of human history, survival was not abstract. Food, shelter, and safety were immediate concerns. And cooperation between men and women was not optional because nature does not accept ideology as payment. Modern society temporarily insulated itself from these pressures through industrialization, global trade, and debt expansion. That insulation created the illusion that the underlying contract no longer mattered. When the cushion deflates, the floor underneath feels much harder than anyone expected. One of the most overlooked aspects of the current economic strain is how it collides with expectations that were formed during unusually easy decades. Many people came of age during periods where housing was relatively affordable compared to income, where entry-level jobs could still support basic independence, and where credit was plentiful and cheap. Cultural narratives were built on those conditions. Independence was framed as permanent and effortless. Partnership was reframed as optional or even restrictive. What was rarely acknowledged was that these narratives depended on economic conditions remaining favorable indefinitely. That assumption is now being stress tested and it is failing. Housing alone tells a powerful story. In many cities, rent increases have outpaced wage growth for years. The idea that one income can comfortably support an individual household has become increasingly unrealistic, especially without family support or shared expenses. When people delay or avoid long term partnerships, the cost of living does not politely adjust downward. It remains fixed, or worse, continues to rise. The math becomes brutal very quickly. This is where many individuals are discovering that independence without surplus income is not freedom, but exposure. Food costs compound the problem. Inflation does not hit all categories equally, but necessities always feel it first. When groceries consume a growing percentage of income, there is less flexibility everywhere else. Savings disappear. Emergency funds evaporate. Small disruptions become crises. In this environment, advice that once sounded empowering begins to sound disconnected. Telling people to simply budget better or work harder ignores structural changes that have narrowed the margin for error to almost nothing. At the same time, the employment landscape is shifting in ways that reward certain skill sets while devaluing others. Jobs tied to tangible output, infrastructure, logistics, technical maintenance, and production have proven more resilient, while roles centered around coordination, presentation, or internal process optimization are being scrutinized more aggressively. This is not personal, it is economic. When companies face uncertainty, they prioritize functions that directly generate or protect revenue. Anything perceived as indirect becomes vulnerable. This shift has exposed a gap between credentialism and competence. Degrees, titles, and certifications that once functioned as security signals are losing power. What matters now is whether a role can be clearly justified on a balance sheet. Many people were encouraged to pursue paths that emphasize social signaling over durable skill acquisition. Those paths looked safe until they were not. The result is a growing pool of workers who are technically educated but economically displaced. While this is happening, many men who opted out of traditional career ladders years ago are finding themselves oddly insulated from the worst effects, not because they are wealthy, but because they are flexible. When you build your life around low fixed cost and variable income, volatility hurts less. When you are not tied to a single employer, industry, or geographic location, downturns become manageable rather than catastrophic. This is not an accident, it is a byproduct of adaptation. What is rarely acknowledged is that this adaptation was not driven by optimism, it was driven by disillusionment. Many men did not leave traditional systems because they believed something better was guaranteed. They left because the cost of participation no longer made sense. The promise of stability was replaced by instability. The promise of respect was replaced by conditional acceptance. Over time, withdrawal became rational. This creates a cultural disconnect that is now becoming visible. On one side, there are individuals who built their identities around narratives of independence and autonomy that assumed economic stability as a given. On the other side, there are individuals who quietly reorganize their lives around self sufficiency, low dependency, and minimal exposure to institutional risk. When conditions worsen, these two groups experience reality very differently. There is also an emotional reckoning happening beneath the economic one. Relationships are not just financial arrangements, but economics shapes emotional expectations, whether people want to admit it or not. When people feel secure, they can afford idealism. When people feel threatened, pragmatism returns. The difficulty is that emotional frameworks do not update as quickly as economic conditions. People cling to beliefs that no longer serve them because changing those beliefs feels like admitting failure. This is why conversations around partnership, cooperation, and responsibility have become so charged. They are no longer theoretical. They are tied directly to survival outcomes. For some, this produces resentment. For others, fear. For others, denial. Very few are approaching the situation calmly because calm requires preparation, and preparation requires foresight. Another layer to this story is demographic. Many societies are aging rapidly. Birth rates are declining. Dependency ratios are worsening. These trends were already putting pressure on social systems before inflation and automation accelerated. When fewer workers support more dependents, the cost of everything rises. When men withdraw from family formation, those demographic pressures intensify. This is not a judgment, it is arithmetic. Governments respond to these pressures in predictable ways. Increased taxation, expanded surveillance, and greater reliance on debt become tempting tools. But these measures often exacerbate the very disengagement they are meant to address. When people feel overburdened and underrepresented, compliance drops. Informal economies grow, trust erodes, the system becomes more brittle. For individuals navigating this environment, the most dangerous response is nostalgia. Longing for a return to conditions that no longer exist delays adaptation. The second most dangerous response is moralization. Framing economic outcomes as personal virtue or vice obscures structural realities and prevents effective solutions. The third most dangerous response is passivity. Waiting for institutions to solve problems they help create is a gamble with poor odds. What actually works is clarity, clear assessment of income versus expenses, clear understanding of marketable skills, clear boundaries around consumption, clear expectations in relationships, clear recognition that stability must be built deliberately rather than assumed. These principles are unglamorous, but they are effective. This brings us back to the broader theme of men walking away. Walking away does not always mean isolation or bitterness. In many cases, it means opting out of narratives that no longer align with lived experience. It means refusing to subsidize systems that offer diminishing returns. It means choosing simplicity over status, autonomy over approval, and resilience over recognition. For women facing increasing economic pressure, the challenge is different but no less real. The skills and strategies that worked during periods of abundance may not work during contraction. Independence without redundancy is fragile. Autonomy without margin is stressful. The solution is not panic, nor is it dependency. It is recalibration, honest recalibration. That recalibration requires acknowledging that cooperation is not weakness, shared responsibility is not failure, interdependence is not oppression. These ideas were temporarily reframed during a unique economic moment. They are being reframed again by reality itself. The question is whether individuals will adapt willingly or be forced to adapt under duress. One of the hardest truths to accept is that systems do not care about intentions. Good intentions do not pay rent. Fairness narratives do not lower grocery bills. Identity validation does not generate income. This does not mean values are meaningless. It means values must be grounded in sustainable structures. When values float free of economics, they become luxuries. As we continue forward, it becomes increasingly clear that the future will reward those who can integrate realism with flexibility, people who can form partnerships based on mutual contribution rather than entitlement, people who can live below their means without resentment, people who can learn new skills without ego, people who can detach self worth from institutional validation. This is not a call to retreat from society. It is a call to engage with it honestly, to see it as it is, not as it was promised to be, to recognize that cycles exist, that abundance is temporary, and that resilience is built during contraction, not expansion. The road ahead will not look like the past decade. It will be leaner, more competitive, and less forgiving of inefficiency. But it will also reward clarity, discipline, and cooperation grounded in reality rather than ideology. Those who adapt early will find stability. Those who resist will experience repeated shocks until adaptation becomes unavoidable. What makes this period especially difficult for so many people is that it is not just an economic transition, it is a psychological one. When systems change slowly, people adjust without realizing it. When systems change quickly, the human mind lags behind the math. We are watching that lag play out in real time. Expectations formed in one economic environment are being carried into a completely different one. And the friction between those two realities is producing confusion, frustration, and denial on a massive scale. For decades, many people were taught to build their lives around narratives instead of balance sheets. Identity became central, while sustainability became secondary. As long as money was cheap and jobs were plentiful, that approach seemed harmless. When the environment shifted, those narratives began to collapse under their own weight. People who were told that fulfillment should come first are now discovering that fulfillment is difficult to access when basic needs are under threat. This is not because fulfillment is unimportant, but because hierarchy still exists, whether we acknowledge it or not. One of the more revealing developments has been how quickly public conversation changes when material pressure increases. Language that once dominated social discourse begins to fade, replaced by quieter, more practical concerns. People start talking about rent again, about food, about transportation, about stability. The volume lowers, not because people care less, but because survival forces focus. When resources tighten, priorities sharpen. This shift exposes another uncomfortable truth. Many institutions that position themselves as moral authorities during times of abundance struggle to offer meaningful solutions during contraction. They are built for signaling, not for shelter. When economic storms arrive, people instinctively look for structures that can withstand pressure. Narratives without infrastructure are exposed very quickly. This is where the contrast between different adaptation strategies becomes clear. Some individuals respond to pressure by demanding external intervention. Others respond by reducing dependency. The second group rarely makes headlines because their actions are quiet. They downsize, they relocate, they learn new skills, they exit systems that no longer serve them. Over time, these individual decisions aggregate into a broader shift that institutions only notice after it is well underway. The decision by millions of men to disengage from traditional social expectations was not coordinated, but it was consistent. It emerged from shared experience rather than shared ideology. When effort no longer reliably translated into security or respect, many recalculated. They asked a simple question: is the cost worth the return? For an increasing number, the answer was no. They did not protest. They did not organize. They simply optimized for peace. Peace in this context does not mean comfort or ease. It means predictability. It means knowing what your obligations are and keeping them manageable. It means reducing exposure to systems that change rules without warning. This approach is not celebrated, but it is effective. When economic conditions worsen, people with fewer dependencies absorb shocks more easily. The ripple effects of this withdrawal are now reaching sectors that assumed constant participation. Housing markets that relied on dual income households face instability when formation rates decline. Consumer industries that depended on discretionary spending feel contraction when minimalist lifestyles spread. Tax systems designed around predictable employment patterns strain when income becomes decentralized. These are not moral failures, they are structural mismatches. At the same time, Women navigating this environment face a different set of challenges. The messaging many received emphasized autonomy without adequately preparing them for volatility. Independence was framed as empowerment, but empowerment without resilience is fragile. When costs rise faster than income, the margin disappears. When the margin disappears, stress dominates decision making. This is where debt becomes particularly dangerous. Debt offers temporary relief while silently narrowing future options. It creates the illusion of stability while eroding it. For individuals without a second income or shared responsibility, debt compounds faster. Minimum payments become traps. Interest becomes a tax on survival. Escaping the cycle requires either increased income, reduced expenses, or both. Neither is easy in a contracting economy. Another underdiscussed factor is how social validation delayed necessary adjustments. In many circles, admitting financial strain was stigmatized. Struggle was reframed as personal failure rather than systemic pressure. People delayed downsizing or restructuring their lives because it felt like regression. In reality, it was adaptation postponed. The longer adaptation is delayed, the more painful it becomes. This dynamic is particularly visible in urban centers. Cities that thrived on high density consumption now face affordability crises. The promise of opportunity clashes with the reality of cost. Those who can leave often do. Those who cannot feel trapped. The result is a stratified population where mobility determines resilience. Flexibility becomes the most valuable asset. Flexibility is not evenly distributed. It depends on skills, health, networks, and mindset. Those who invested in portable skills fare better. Those tied to location dependent roles struggle more. This is another reason why men who shifted toward digital income and low overhead lifestyles earlier now appear insulated. They built flexibility before it became urgent. There is also a cultural reckoning happening around effort and reward. For years, the idea that hard work would be recognized was questioned. Now, the idea that work itself is optional is being questioned. When survival becomes harder, contribution becomes more visible. Societies rediscover the value of roles that keep systems running, often too late to encourage new entrants quickly. This is not about romanticizing hardship or glorifying austerity. It is about acknowledging that comfort is not guaranteed. It must be supported by productive capacity. When consumption outpaces production for too long, correction follows. That correction does not care who believed what, it only measures inputs and outputs. As conditions tighten, relationship dynamics inevitably shift, expectations adjust. Negotiations become more explicit. What was once implicit must be stated. Who contributes what? Who supports whom? Under what conditions? These conversations are uncomfortable because they strip away fantasy, but they are necessary for stability. The idea that cooperation should be unconditional does not survive scarcity. Cooperation becomes conditional on reciprocity. This is not cynicism, it is biology. Mutual benefit sustains systems. One sided arrangements collapse under pressure. This is why narratives that frame any discussion of contribution as problematic fail during downturns. Reality demands accounting. Another consequence of prolonged instability is fatigue, emotional fatigue, cognitive fatigue, decision fatigue. People become less patient with abstraction. They want solutions that work, not theories that sound good. This shift often surprises institutions that built influence through language rather than results. Trust migrates toward those who demonstrate competence quietly. This migration is visible in online spaces. Communities focused on practical advice grow. Channels that discuss budgeting, skill acquisition, and self sufficiency attract attention. Spectacle loses power, substance gains it. This is a predictable response to uncertainty. For men who have already embraced low dependency lifestyles, this environment reinforces their choices. For women who are newly confronting economic vulnerability, it forces reevaluation. Neither position is inherently superior. Both are responses to the same pressure. The challenge is whether dialogue can replace defensiveness. Defensiveness thrives when people feel accused. Productive conversation requires framing issues as shared problems rather than moral failures. The economy is not punishing individuals for beliefs, it is responding to behavior at scale. Adjusting behavior is the only lever individuals control. This brings us to the concept of responsibility. Responsibility has been framed negatively for a long time as burden rather than agency. In reality, responsibility is power. It is the ability to influence outcomes. When responsibility is avoided, agency shrinks. When responsibility is embraced, options expand. Men who walked away from traditional roles did not abandon responsibility entirely. They redirected it inward. Responsibility for their own stability, health, and peace. Women who were encouraged to prioritize independence now face the task of redefining responsibility in a more hostile environment. The solution is not retreat, it is recalibration. Recalibration requires honesty about trade offs. No path is free of cost. Independence costs redundancy. Partnership costs autonomy. Stability costs flexibility. Freedom costs security. Choosing consciously is better than drifting into consequences. As the economic landscape continues to evolve, the individuals who fare best will be those who understand that adaptation is not betrayal of past beliefs. It is alignment with present reality. Holding on to outdated frameworks out of pride is expensive. Letting go is uncomfortable but efficient. This period will produce narratives of blame, but blame does not build shelter. It will produce calls for rescue. But rescue without reform is temporary. What endures is competence, cooperation, and clarity. As conditions continue to tighten, something else becomes apparent that many people did not anticipate. When pressure increases, systems reveal their true priorities. What was once described as inclusive, flexible, and supportive begins to narrow its focus to efficiency and output. This shift feels abrupt to those who believed the earlier messaging was permanent. In reality, it was conditional, sustained by favorable circumstances rather than durable foundations. When those circumstances change, language follows money, not the other way around. This is why so many people are experiencing what would see a sense of betrayal, even though no explicit promises were made. The implied guarantees of stability, upward mobility, and independence were absorbed as facts rather than possibilities. When those guarantees fail to materialize, frustration seeks a target. Sometimes it lands on institutions, sometimes on other groups, sometimes, inward. Rarely does it land on the underlying assumption that prosperity was guaranteed. What makes this particularly difficult is that the transition is uneven. Some people are doing relatively well, others are struggling significantly. This unevenness fuels resentment because it creates the impression that outcomes are arbitrary or unfair. In truth, outcomes are correlated with adaptability, timing, and exposure to risk. Those who positioned themselves for flexibility before it became necessary experienced the transition as manageable. Those who did not experience it as a shock. This unevenness is also why blanket explanations fail. No single narrative captures the full picture. Some women are thriving, some men are struggling, some partnerships are strengthening, others are dissolving. The trend is not uniform, but the direction is clear. Volatility is increasing. Stability is becoming conditional rather than assumed. One of the most telling indicators of this shift is how quickly social expectations change when incentives change. Ideas that were once celebrated lose traction. Behaviors that were once discouraged regain legitimacy. This is not hypocrisy, it is adaptation. Societies adjust their values to match survival needs, even if they pretend otherwise. Consider how discussions around self sufficiency have evolved. Not long ago, self sufficiency was framed as isolation or avoidance. Now, it is increasingly framed as prudence. The language shifts subtly, but the behavior changes decisively. People who once dismissed preparation now quietly engage in it. Emergency funds, side incomes, skill diversification, and geographic mobility become priorities again. Not because people suddenly changed to their values, but because circumstances forced recalibration. This recalibration extends into personal relationships as well. Expectations around contribution are becoming more explicit. Vague ideals give way to practical considerations. Can this arrangement support both people if conditions worsen? Can responsibilities be shared reliably? Can conflict be navigated without destabilizing everything else? These questions are uncomfortable because they replace fantasy with accounting, but they are unavoidable in a tightening environment. For men who have already stepped back from traditional relationship frameworks, these conversations may feel irrelevant. Their lives are structured to minimize dependency. For women who are re entering or re-evaluating partnership considerations, the landscape feels harsher than expected. The cultural assurances they relied on no longer buffer economic reality. This creates tension, not because either side is wrong, but because timing matters, and timing is one of the least acknowledged factors in success. Being right too early looks like failure. Being right too late feels like loss. Many of the adaptations now being discussed quietly were mocked or dismissed years ago. Minimalism, remote income, reduced consumption, delayed gratification. Now they are survival strategies. The lesson here is not about who was right, but about how quickly environments can flip incentives. Another element complicating this transition is institutional inertia. Large systems are slow to change direction. Policies designed for expansion struggle during contraction. Programs built to encourage participation strain when participation declines. This lag creates gaps that individuals must bridge on their own. Those who wait for institutions to catch up often find themselves waiting too long. This is especially relevant when discussing employment. Education systems continue to funnel people into pathways that no longer guarantee stability. Employers continue to demand credentials that do not align with actual needs. Workers are left navigating mismatches that cost time and money. Those who break from these pipelines earlier experience less disruption. Those who remain invested experience more. As a result, informal learning, peer networks, and self directed skill acquisition gain importance. People stop asking what they are supposed to do and start asking what works. This shift reduces reliance on authority and increases experimentation. Not all experiments succeed, but the process itself builds resilience. Resilience is the defining trait of this era. Not optimism, not confidence, resilience, the ability to absorb shock, adjust behavior, and continue forward without collapsing. Resilience does not require belief in a narrative, it requires preparation and humility. Humility is difficult because it requires acknowledging that previous assumptions may no longer apply. For many, this feels like personal failure. In reality, it is environmental change. The economy does not validate identity, it responds to behavior. Adjusting behavior is not surrender, it is intelligence. This distinction matters because shame is a powerful inhibitor of adaptation. When people feel ashamed of struggling, they hide it. When they hide it, they delay change. When they delay change, outcomes worsen. Removing moral judgment from economic adjustment is essential for recovery. This is where the conversation around men walking away intersects with broader societal change. Walking away is often mischaracterized as avoidance or bitterness. In many cases, it is strategic withdrawal, reducing exposure to risk, simplifying obligations, reclaiming time. These decisions are not loud, but they compound. The compounding effect of millions of small withdrawals is significant. Participation declines, demand shifts, norms change, systems built on constant engagement begin to falter. This is not sabotage, it is response. Women navigating this shift face a different kind of recalibration. Many were encouraged to prioritize self expression and independence without parallel emphasis on redundancy and risk management. That approach worked during stability. During volatility, it becomes fragile. Rebuilding resilience requires integrating pragmatism without abandoning dignity. There is no shame in needing cooperation. Humans are cooperative by design. What creates conflict is pretending cooperation is unnecessary until it becomes urgent. By the time urgency arrives, trust may already be depleted. Trust is another casualty of prolonged instability. When people feel misled, trust erodes. When trust erodes, collaboration becomes transactional. When collaboration becomes transactional, warmth disappears. This is not ideal, but it is predictable. Rebuilding trust requires consistency, not messaging, repeated demonstration of reliability, clear boundaries, real contribution. These things cannot be rushed. They take time, and time is scarce when pressure is high. This scarcity of time amplifies stress and accelerates decision making. People make choices faster, sometimes without full information. Mistakes increase, learning curves steepen. Those who survive do so by learning quickly and adjusting repeatedly. One of the quiet truths of this period is that many people will rebuild their lives smaller than they imagined. Smaller homes, fewer possessions, simpler routines, less social noise. This downsizing is often framed as loss. It can also be framed as recalibration. Smaller systems are easier to manage, they break less dramatically. The idea that bigger is always better is another assumption being challenged. Scale magnifies fragility. Complexity increases failure points. Simplicity increases resilience. These principles apply to finances, relationships, and institutions alike. As this transition unfolds, the people who struggle most are often those who cling hardest to symbolic victories. Titles without income, status without stability, validation without protection. When symbols detach from substance, collapse follows quickly. This does not mean ambition is wrong. It means ambition must be grounded. Aspirations unsupported by structure are expensive fantasies. Aspirations aligned with capability become plans. Another important shift is how people evaluate success. Success becomes less about visibility and more about durability. Can you maintain your lifestyle if income drops temporarily? Can you absorb an unexpected expense without crisis? Can you adjust without losing identity? These questions replace older metrics. For men who have already adjusted expectations downward, this shift feels familiar. For women whose expectations were shaped during abundance, it feels disorienting. Neither experience is wrong, both reflect timing. As the economic environment continues to evolve, narratives will continue to clash. Some will demand restoration of past conditions. Others will quietly build parallel paths. History suggests that parallel paths win, not because they are loud, but because they function. Functionality always outlasts ideology. Systems that work endure. Systems that require belief to survive collapse when belief fades. This period will eventually stabilize, but not before forcing widespread adaptation. The question is not whether change will happen, but how much friction it will create along the way. Those who adapt early experience less pain. Those who resist experience repeated shocks. Understanding this does not require cynicism, it requires realism. The economy is not cruel, it is indifferent, it does not punish belief. It responds to behavior. And that brings us closer to the core truth underlying everything discussed so far. Stability is not something granted, it is something constructed through cooperation, competence, restraint, and adaptation. When any of those elements are removed, stability weakens. As this transition deepens, one of the most difficult realizations for many people is that there is no external reset coming to restore things to the way they felt before. There is no switch that gets flipped where affordability returns overnight, expectations realign effortlessly, and trust magically rebuilds itself. What exists instead is a long adjustment period where individuals either reshape their lives intentionally or are reshaped by pressure without consent. The difference between those two outcomes is agency. Agency is often misunderstood as control. In reality, agency is the ability to respond intelligently to circumstances you did not choose. No one chose inflation. No one chose housing scarcity. No one chose technological acceleration at this scale. But everyone chooses how long they deny its effects. Denial is comfortable in the short term because it postpones difficult decisions. Over time, denial becomes expensive. This is why the emotional tone of public conversation feels increasingly brittle. People sense that something fundamental has shifted, but they cannot easily articulate what it is. They argue over surface level explanations because confronting the deeper structural change would require re examining identity, values, and long held assumptions. That kind of reevaluation is destabilizing, especially when people already feel under threat. One of the more revealing patterns is how quickly confidence evaporates when economic conditions deteriorate. Confidence that was once framed as inherent turns out to be conditional. When income is steady, confidence feels internal. When income is unstable, confidence becomes situational. This is not a character flaw, it is human. Security underwrites self assurance more than most people want to admit. This is particularly relevant when discussing narratives of independence. Independence sounds powerful when resources are abundant. When resources tighten, independence without support feels isolating rather than empowering. The problem is not independence itself, but the assumption that independence can exist without buffers. Buffers are created through redundancy. Redundancy comes from shared responsibility, diversified income, and manageable obligations. Remove those, and independence becomes exposure. This is where many people encounter cognitive dissonance. They were taught that needing others was weakness. Now they feel that weakness creeping in, not because they suddenly became less capable, but because the environment changed. Resolving that dissonance requires reframing cooperation as strength rather than failure. That reframing is difficult when past messaging framed cooperation as compromise rather than strategy. For men who disengaged earlier, this reframing already occurred privately. They stopped seeking validation from systems that no longer rewarded participation and began prioritizing self containment. That choice reduced upside, but it also reduced downside. Over time, that trade off proved sustainable. For women confronting rising vulnerability, the reframing is happening under pressure rather than preparation, which makes it feel punitive rather than strategic. Pressure accelerates learning, but it also increases error rates. This is why many people are making abrupt decisions that create new problems while trying to solve old ones. Rapid relocation without income stability, career pivots without skill alignment, relationship decisions driven by fear rather than compatibility. These choices are understandable, but they often compound stress rather than relieve it. The alternative is slower, more deliberate adjustment, fewer dramatic moves, more incremental changes. downsizing before crisis, skill building before job loss, boundary setting before resentment. These adjustments lack drama, which is why they are rarely celebrated, but they work. Another underappreciated factor in this transition is how silence can be misinterpreted. When men do not loudly protest, their disengagement is often dismissed as apathy. In reality, silence can be a form of clarity. When participation no longer offers benefit, disengagement is rational. The mistake many make is assuming silence means compliance or return. It often means resolution. This misunderstanding fuels frustration. Some expect men to re engage once conditions worsen, assuming economic pressure will force reconciliation. What they fail to account for is adaptation. Men who reorganize their lives around low obligation structures are not under the same pressure. Their needs are smaller. Their systems are simpler. They are not immune to hardship, but they are less exposed to systemic failure. This asymmetry creates a sense of imbalance that is emotionally charged. It feels unfair to those experiencing strain. But fairness is not the metric reality uses. Reality uses resilience. Systems that can absorb shock persist. Systems that cannot fail. This does not mean men have solved everything or that women are incapable of adaptation. It means timing and incentives matter. Those who adapted early gained options. Those adapting late face constraints. This pattern appears in every economic transition, regardless of ideology. Another reality emerging is how transactional everything becomes when trust erodes. When people no longer believe systems will protect them, they begin negotiating every interaction explicitly. What do I get? What do I give? What happens if things go wrong? This transactional framing is often criticized as cold, but it is a survival response. Warmth requires safety. When safety disappears, calculation replaces generosity. This transactional shift affects dating, employment, friendships, and even family dynamics. People become more selective, less forgiving, more cautious. Emotional investment decreases because emotional loss becomes harder to absorb when resources are strained. This creates a feedback loop where connection weakens just as cooperation becomes more necessary. Breaking that loop requires intentional rebuilding of trust, but trust cannot be demanded. It must be demonstrated consistently over time. That process is slow and fragile, especially when people are already exhausted. And exhaustion is another defining feature of this period. Not physical exhaustion alone, but mental exhaustion, decision fatigue, information overload, constant adaptation. When people are exhausted, they default to familiar patterns, even if those patterns no longer serve them. This is why some cling to outdated beliefs long past their usefulness. Changing beliefs requires energy they do not feel they have. This exhaustion also explains why simplistic explanations gain traction. Complex realities are tiring. Simple villains are comforting. Unfortunately, comfort does not solve problems, it delays solutions. The harder truth is that no single group caused this situation, and no single group can fix it alone. Economic shifts are cumulative outcomes of policy, technology, culture, and human behavior interacting over time. Blame narratives are emotionally satisfying, but practically useless. What actually improves outcomes is alignment, aligning expectations with reality, aligning spending with income, aligning skills with demand, aligning relationships with mutual contribution. Alignment reduces friction, misalignment creates stress. This is why the most stable individuals during this period are often those with modest expectations. They are not chasing constant expansion. They are focused on maintenance. Maintenance is undervalued culturally, but it is essential during contraction. Maintaining stability is harder than pursuing growth when conditions are favorable. Maintenance requires discipline. It requires saying no to opportunities that add complexity without resilience. It requires resisting social pressure to perform success. It requires choosing boring solutions over exciting risks. These choices rarely receive praise, but they preserve optionality. Optionality is the hidden currency of resilience, the ability to change direction when conditions change, the ability to exit without collapse, the ability to absorb loss without panic. Optionality is built through savings, skills, health, and low dependency. Once lost, it is difficult to rebuild quickly. And for individuals watching this unfold and feeling overwhelmed, the most important thing to understand is that adaptation does not require radical reinvention. It requires incremental recalibration, small expense reductions, small income diversification, small skill upgrades, small boundary adjustments. Over time, these compound. Compounding works both ways. Small neglects compound into crisis. Small preparations compound into stability. The difference is visibility. Crisis is loud. Stability is quiet. This is why many people misjudge who is doing well. Visibility does not equal security. Some of the most visibly confident people are the most financially exposed. Some of the quietest people are the most resilient. Appearances are unreliable indicators during transition. Another lesson emerging is that resilience is relational as much as individual. Strong networks buffer shock, weak networks amplify it. Networks built on performance collapse under stress. Networks built on reciprocity endure. This applies to friendships, families, and communities. The challenge is that reciprocity requires contribution, and contribution requires capacity. When people feel depleted, contribution feels impossible. This creates a cycle where everyone waits for someone else to move first. Breaking that cycle requires leadership at the micro level. One person choosing to stabilize rather than escalate. One person choosing honesty over performance. These micro decisions scale, not through grand movements, but through quiet example. People notice what works, they copy it. Over time, norms shift. The idea that everything will eventually normalize without effort is comforting, but false. Normalization requires adjustment. The shape of the future will reflect the choices people make now, not the preferences they express. As this long adjustment period continues, one of the most revealing shifts is how people begin to redefine what security actually means. For years, security was equated with credentials, titles, and symbolic markers of success. A degree meant safety, a job title meant stability, a social narrative meant protection. What is becoming increasingly clear is that these markers only function when the systems behind them are healthy. When systems weaken, symbols lose power very quickly. What replaces them is something far less glamorous, but far more reliable: the ability to function independently of fragile structures. This realization forces a difficult reckoning. Many people built their lives around external validation rather than internal capacity. They optimized for approval rather than adaptability. During expansion, this approach paid off socially and professionally. During contraction, it creates vulnerability. The shift away from validation toward capability is uncomfortable because it removes familiar measuring sticks. There is no applause for quiet competence. There is no public recognition for avoiding crisis, but competence preserves stability when recognition disappears. Another truth that emerges during prolonged pressure is that fairness and sustainability are not the same thing. Many arrangements feel fair during abundance, but prove unsustainable during scarcity. When resources shrink, systems are forced to prioritize continuity over equality. This is not cruelty, it is triage. The systems that survive are the ones that can continue functioning, not the ones that feel most equitable in theory. This distinction is important because it explains why certain expectations collapse so quickly under stress. People often assume that fairness guarantees survival. History shows the opposite. Survival determines which versions of fairness remain possible. When people misunderstand this, they experience change as betrayal rather than correction. Correction is an unpopular word because it implies error. Nobody likes to believe they were wrong, especially when their choices were socially rewarded at the time. But correction does not imply stupidity or malice. It implies changing conditions. When conditions change, strategies must change. Refusing to correct becomes costly. One of the reasons this moment feels especially disorienting is that many people were taught that progress is linear, that each generation would automatically enjoy more stability, more opportunity, and more freedom than the last. This belief worked as long as productivity gains outpaced population growth and debt expansion. When those curves flatten or reverse, linear progress breaks down. Cycles return. Cycles are uncomfortable because they contradict modern narratives of constant advancement, but cycles are normal. They are how systems reset imbalances. Ignoring cycles does not eliminate them, it only makes their correction more abrupt. In this cycle, the imbalance was not just economic, it was relational. Expectations around contribution drifted far from output. Responsibility was redistributed unevenly. Incentives were distorted. For a time, debt masked the consequences. Now those consequences are arriving. This is where the idea of men walking away becomes more than a cultural talking point. It becomes an economic signal. When a large segment of a population disengages from traditional roles without collapsing, it reveals inefficiencies in those roles. It shows that participation was not as mutually beneficial as assumed. Systems that rely on obligation rather than incentive eventually lose participants. This does not mean men abandoned society entirely. Many simply reduced their footprint within it. Less consumption, fewer liabilities, lower exposure. This shift is invisible in many metrics, but powerful in effect. Reduced consumption weakens growth models built on constant expansion. Reduced liabilities reduce leverage over individuals. Reduced exposure increases autonomy. Autonomy, however, comes with trade offs: less upside, less status, less integration. The men who chose this path accepted those trade offs consciously. That acceptance is what makes the path sustainable. The problem arises when people want the benefits of autonomy without accepting its cost, or the benefits of interdependence without accepting responsibility. Women facing increasing economic strain are often caught between these competing models. The promise of independence collides with the reality of cost. The promise of support collides with the erosion of trust. Navigating this tension requires decalibrating expectations without surrendering self respect. That is not easy, especially when cultural scripts offer little guidance for doing so gracefully. Another aspect of this period is how quickly patience wears thin. When survival feels uncertain, tolerance for ambiguity drops. People want answers, not nuance. They want certainty, not probability. Unfortunately, certainty is rarely available during transition. This creates fertile ground for oversimplified solutions and emotional appeals that feel satisfying but fail to deliver results. The people who resist these appeals often appear detached or unsympathetic. In reality, they are conserving energy. Emotional energy is finite. During instability, spending it on outrage or performative concern leaves less available for adaptation. Quiet focus becomes a survival trait. This is why many of the most resilient individuals appear emotionally muted, not because they do not care, but because they cannot afford constant emotional fluctuation. Stability requires consistency. Consistency requires restraint. Restraint is deeply unfashionable in a culture that celebrates expression and visibility. Yet restraint is what allows systems to endure stress. This applies at every level. Financial restraint preserves optionality. Emotional restraint preserves relationships. Strategic restraint preserves flexibility. As people gradually internalize this, priorities shift. Less emphasis on winning arguments, more emphasis on preserving bandwidth, less emphasis on being right, more emphasis on being solvent, less emphasis on appearances, more emphasis on function. This shift is not glamorous, but it is stabilizing. It creates a different kind of confidence, one rooted in capability rather than affirmation. This confidence does not broadcast itself, it does not need to. One of the most difficult lessons during this period is learning to separate identity from circumstance. Many people fuse their sense of self to roles that no longer exist or no longer provide security. When those roles disappear, identity feels threatened. This is why job loss, financial stress, or relationship changes feel existential rather than situational. Untangling identity from circumstance allows for adaptation without collapse. You are not your job. You are not your income level. You are not your relationship status. These are conditions, not essence. Recognizing this does not eliminate pain, but it prevents paralysis. Men who walked away earlier often went through this identity separation quietly. Losing traditional markers forced them to rebuild self definition internally. That process was uncomfortable, but it produced resilience. Women now facing similar dislocation are being asked to do the same work under far less forgiving conditions. That makes it harder, not impossible. Another misconception that surfaces during this time is the belief that cooperation must look like the past to be valid. New forms of cooperation are emerging, often informal and decentralized. Shared housing arrangements, skill sharing networks, remote collaboration, community based resource pooling. These models lack the polish of institutional solutions, but they function. Functionality matters more than aesthetics during contraction. People gravitate toward what works, even if it lacks ideological purity. This pragmatic turn is often mistaken for regression. In reality, it is innovation constrained by reality. Innovation under constraint is more durable than innovation under abundance. It is tested immediately. It cannot rely on endless funding or tolerance for inefficiency. It must deliver value quickly or be abandoned. This process weeds out fragile ideas and preserves robust ones. As these new models develop, they challenge old assumptions about what stability looks like. Stability may no longer mean permanence, it may mean adaptability. It may mean being able to move, pivot, and adjust without catastrophic loss. This kind of stability is harder to sell culturally, but easier to sustain economically. Another emerging theme is the reevaluation of time. During abundance, time is spent freely. During contraction, time becomes precious. People become more selective about where they invest attention and effort. This selectivity often feels isolating to those accustomed to constant engagement. In reality, it is boundary setting. Boundary setting is essential for resilience. Without boundaries, demands multiply endlessly. With boundaries, capacity is protected. This applies to finances, work, relationships, and information consumption. Learning to say no without justification becomes a survival skill. This skill is particularly important for those who feel pressure to compensate for systemic problems personally. You cannot personally solve structural instability. You can only manage your exposure to it. Overextending yourself in the name of fairness or virtue leads to burnout, not reform. Burnout is one of the quiet casualties of this period. Many people are exhausted not because they are lazy, but because they are trying to uphold expectations that no longer align with reality. Letting go of those expectations feels like failure, but continuing to chase them guarantees collapse. Letting go does not mean giving up, it means choosing sustainable paths over aspirational ones that no longer make sense. This is a mature form of ambition, one focused on endurance rather than acceleration. And as this conversation moves closer to its conclusion, the central message becomes increasingly clear. The future will belong to those who can integrate realism without bitterness, cooperation without dependency, and independence without isolation. Extremes fail during volatility, balance endures. The people who navigate this transition best will not be those who cling hardest to past narratives or demand restoration of old guarantees. They will be those who accept change early, adjust quietly, and build systems that can survive uncertainty. This is not a call to despair, it is a call to maturity. Every major economic transition forces a reckoning. The choices made during these periods shape decades that follow. The question each person faces is simple, even if the answer is not. Will you adapt deliberately, or will you wait until pressure removes choice? Will you build resilience quietly, or perform confidence publicly while stability erodes underneath? That question does not require ideology to answer, it requires honesty. As everything discussed throughout this video comes together, the most important realization is that what we are witnessing is not a temporary disruption, but a structural shift. The world many people plan their lives around no longer exists in the same form, and it is not coming back simply because enough people want it to. Economic environments evolve, incentives realign, and social arrangements either adapt or dissolve. What feels shocking now will eventually feel obvious in hindsight, but only after the transition has already reshaped countless lives. One of the hardest lessons for people to accept is that stability is no longer something that can be outsourced. For a long time, stability was delegated to institutions, employers, governments, and cultural norms. People trusted that if they followed the script, things would work out. Education would lead to opportunity. Work would lead to security. Participation would lead to protection. That script was never guaranteed, but it worked well enough for long enough that many assumed it always would. Now that assumption is being tested, and the results are uncomfortable. This discomfort is not evenly distributed, and that is why emotions are running so high. Some people feel blindsided, others feel vindicated, and many feel simply tired. Fatigue is an underappreciated force in this moment. When people are exhausted, they lose patience for complexity. They want certainty, clarity, and resolution. Unfortunately, transitions rarely offer those things on demand. They offer trade offs instead. The trade off most people are now facing is between comfort and control. Comfort comes from familiarity, from staying within known systems, from hoping that existing structures will stabilize again. Control comes from adjustment, from reducing dependency, from accepting short term discomfort in exchange for long term resilience. Neither path is painless. The difference is where the pain shows up and how long it lasts. Those who delay adjustment often experience a slow accumulation of stress that eventually forces abrupt change under worse conditions. Those who adjust early experience discomfort up front but gain room to maneuver later. This pattern repeats across history, regardless of culture or ideology. Early adaptation looks unnecessary until it becomes obvious that it was essential. This is why so many people who quietly simplified their lives years ago now appear oddly calm. Not because they predicted everything correctly, but because they reduced variables they could not control. Lower expenses, fewer obligations, diversified income, and realistic expectations create buffers. Buffers turn crises into inconveniences, and inconveniences into learning experiences. Without buffers, even small disruptions become existential threats. The conversation around men walking away fits into this pattern precisely. Men who disengaged from traditional expectations were not making a political statement. They were responding to incentives. When effort stopped producing proportional returns, disengagement became rational. When participation carried increasing risk with diminishing reward, Withdrawal became a form of self preservation. Over time, that withdrawal hardened into a lifestyle built around autonomy and low exposure. What many failed to anticipate is that once people reorganize their lives around low dependency, they do not easily return to high obligation systems, not out of spite, but because the math no longer makes sense. You do not voluntarily reintroduce risk after you have learned to live without it. This is not cruelty, it is learning. For women now facing increasing economic pressure, this reality feels harsh because it collides with expectations formed under very different conditions. Many were encouraged to pursue independence without being equally encouraged to build redundancy. Independence was framed as empowerment, but empowerment without margin is fragile. When costs rise and income stagnates, fragility becomes visible very quickly. The uncomfortable truth is that independence and interdependence are not moral categories, they are strategies. Each has advantages and costs. Each works better under certain conditions. The mistake many made was treating one as universally superior regardless of environment. Environments change, strategies must change with them. This does not mean people should abandon autonomy or self respect. It means they must integrate realism into their choices. Cooperation does not negate independence, it can reinforce it when structured correctly. Shared responsibility does not erase agency, it can expand it by creating buffers. The problem is not cooperation itself, but cooperation without clarity or reciprocity. Reciprocity is the foundation of any stable system. When reciprocity breaks down, resentment grows. When resentment grows, participation declines. When participation declines, systems weaken. This cycle does not care about intention, it responds only to behavior. Rebuilding reciprocity requires honesty about contribution, expectations, and limits. And honesty is difficult when it threatens identity. Many people built identities around narratives that are now under strain. Admitting that those narratives were incomplete feels like personal failure. In reality, it is environmental mismatch. No strategy works forever. Adaptation is not betrayal of values, it is alignment with reality. Another difficult truth is that not everyone will adapt successfully. Some will cling to old frameworks until circumstances force change under the worst possible conditions. Others will adapt partially but resist fully integrating new realities. A smaller group will adapt early, quietly, and consistently. Outcomes will diverge sharply over time, even among people who started in similar positions. This divergence will create more tension, not less. As some stabilize, others struggle, and resentment will seek explanation. It will be tempting to frame outcomes as moral judgments. Who deserves what? Who caused what? These narratives are emotionally satisfying, but practically useless. They do not lower costs, increase skills, or rebuild trust. What actually moves people forward are boring decisions repeated consistently: spending less than you earn, avoiding unnecessary debt, learning skills that travel across industries, maintaining health, setting boundaries, choosing relationships based on contribution rather than validation. These decisions lack drama, which is why they are often ignored until crisis arrives. The irony is that many of the things now framed as harsh realism were once considered common sense. Live within your means. Build for hard times during good times. Choose stability over appearances. These ideas fell out of favor during long periods of abundance. Now they are returning, not because anyone wants them to, but because they work. Another major shift happening quietly is the reevaluation of what success looks like. Success is becoming less visible and more functional. Can you sleep without constant financial anxiety? Can you handle an unexpected expense? Can you walk away from a bad situation without collapse? These are the new markers of success in a volatile environment. This redefinition unsettles those who built their sense of worth around external metrics. Titles, lifestyles, and social validation lose meaning when they are not backed by resilience. This does not make those pursuits wrong, it makes them insufficient on their own. As the economy continues to adjust, people will be forced to confront trade offs they previously avoided. Do you want flexibility or predictability? Autonomy or integration? Simplicity or status? There are no universally correct answers, only answers that align or misalign with reality. Pretending otherwise delays adaptation. One of the most important things to understand is that this period is not about punishment, it is about correction. Systems that drifted too far from sustainability are being pulled back by constraint. Constraint feels oppressive when you are used to abundance. It feels stabilizing when you understand its purpose. Constraint forces prioritization, it forces clarity, it reveals what actually matters versus what was merely convenient. Many people are discovering that they do not need as much as they thought, but they do need stability more than they realized. For men who have already reduced their footprint, this period confirms lessons learned earlier. For women now facing recalibration, it presents an opportunity to rebuild strategies grounded in reality rather than narrative. Neither position is superior. Both reflect different timing within the same cycle. And the path forward is not about returning to old arrangements exactly as they were. It is about constructing new arrangements that account for what has changed. Technology, demographics, costs, and incentives are different now. Pretending otherwise is not optimism, it is avoidance. A constructive adaptation will not be driven by outrage or nostalgia. It will be driven by quiet competence, by people who stop waiting for permission to adjust, by those who accept discomfort early to avoid collapse later, by those who understand that dignity comes from capability, not applause. As this video comes to a close, the most important thing I want to leave you with is this: the future is not something that happens to you, it is something you prepare for, one decision at a time. The people who will make it through this period with the least damage are not the loudest, the angriest, or the most validated. They are the most adaptable. Adaptation does not require abandoning principles, it requires refining them. It requires separating what you believe from what actually works and then building bridges between the two. That process is uncomfortable, but it is necessary. We are living through a recalibration of expectations, responsibilities, and relationships. It will reshape how people live, work, and connect. Some will resist until they have no choice, others will move early and quietly. History suggests the latter fare better. I want to know what you think about everything we discussed today. Do you agree with this perspective? Do you see these shifts happening around you? Leave a comment and share your thoughts because these conversations matter, especially now. Like the video if you like it. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.